Welcome to the Blue Cafe. We offer stories of betrayal, infidelity, and redemption, raw, honest, and deeply human. Each episode dives into the tangled lives of those facing heartbreak and hard choices, where truth isn't always clean, but growth is always possible. Now on to today's story.
Aspen Shadows. Chapter 1, Winter's Veil. Snowfall in Aspen has a way of softening everything. The streets, the jagged peaks, even the hard edges of memory. Tonight, though, as I stood on the balcony of our mountainside home, watching flakes spiral down through the blue-black night, the hush of winter didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a shroud. Below me, the lights of the valley glittered like scattered diamonds, chalets glowing warm against the cold, ski lifts threading up the mountainside like veins of molten gold. It was a perfect postcard view, the kind magazines used to sell fantasies. My life, at least on the surface, matched the image. Founder and managing partner of Mercer Capital. Net worth north of 8 figures. Aspen property. Private memberships at Snowmass and the Little Nell. A wife everyone adored, Sophia, with her easy laugh and camera-ready charm. And a social circle that included hedge fund titans, pro athletes, and more than a few Hollywood faces. Everything looked untouchable. That was the point. Inside, the party hummed at full speed. Strings of soft Edison bulbs wound around pine beams, the smell of cedar logs and truffle oil drifting through the air. Waiters in black carried flutes of Dom Perignon through a roomful of Aspen's elite. I spotted Mark Finley, CEO of a renewable energy fund, holding court by the fireplace. Across from him, an actress whose name I could never remember leaned too far into the arm of a ski apparel tycoon. Laughter rose, glasses clinked. The night was flawless, curated, staged down to the last imported white orchid. And yet, beneath the polish, something gnawed at me. "Ethan," I turned. Sophia stood framed in the arched doorway, one hand resting lightly on the carved banister. She wore an off-shoulder emerald gown that made her dark hair look even glossier, the kind of effortless elegance that drew every eye in the room. Mine included. "You've been out here a while," she said, smiling faintly. "Everything okay?" "Just needed a breath," I said. Her eyes, warm brown flecked with gold, searched mine for a beat longer than usual, as if trying to gauge something unspoken. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down quickly, screen angled away, and whatever tenderness had hovered between us evaporated. "Work?" I asked casual. "Charity committee," she said, slipping the phone into her clutch. "Last-minute guest list changes. Nothing dramatic." She leaned in and kissed my cheek. "Come back inside, Mr. Host. People are asking for you." I followed her in, smile fixed, the picture of a devoted husband. But something in the exchange left me unsettled, a tiny tremor in the surface tension of our lives. The party wound down past midnight. Guests filtered out in a staggered stream, chauffeured SUVs whisking them back toward private lodges and boutique hotels. I walked Mark Finley to the door, exchanging promises of a snowcat trip next weekend. When the last of them had gone, I killed the playlist and let silence settle into the beams of the house. Sophia was upstairs in our bedroom. I found her sitting cross-legged on the duvet, laptop open, headphones in. She didn't hear me at first. Her face was lit by the screen glow, expression soft, private, almost wistful. "What are you working on?" I asked. She startled slightly, sliding one earbud out. "Oh, just reviewing photos from tonight. Posting for the gala page." I nodded, though my gaze flicked to the laptop screen. I caught a glimpse, a chat window, open at the corner. A name I didn't recognize. The last message unread. "Can't stop thinking about last weekend." Sophia tilted the screen closed before I could read further. "I'll be down soon," she said lightly. I didn't ask. Not yet. The next morning brought a sky so clean and sharp it hurt to look at. The peaks rose blinding white against an endless blue, the promise of fresh powder pulling skiers into the lifts by dawn. Aspen had that effect. It convinced you everything was perfect, even when it wasn't. At breakfast, Sophia hummed softly as she poured coffee. "You're quiet," I said. "Am I?" She smiled absently, scrolling through her phone. "I'm thinking I might head to the spa after lunch. They're running some new wellness program, sound therapy, oxygen chambers, that sort of thing." "You've been going a lot lately," I said, keeping my tone light. She shrugged. "It helps me decompress." You should try it sometime. I smiled and sipped my coffee. Maybe I will. But I knew she wouldn't be at the spa. That afternoon, I called and asked discreetly for her appointment record. There was none. Not for today. Not for the last 3 she'd claimed. By the end of the week, patterns had emerged. Sudden girls' weekends in Vail. Last-minute charity planning sessions that never showed up on any calendar. Texts she left half-hidden, like bait without a hook. Each inconsistency was small, almost trivial on its own. But stacked together, they built a structure, a shape I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. That wasn't my style. Instead, I waited. I watched. I told myself it was strategy. In truth, part of me still hoped there was an explanation, something benign that would dissolve this creeping paranoia. But every time I looked at her, laughing across the room at dinners, dazzling in curated social photos, I saw a stranger wearing my wife's face. 2 weeks later, the St. Regis hosted a private networking dinner for hedge fund managers and real estate moguls. I noticed Sophia dressing for the night with more care than usual. Deep crimson silk, hair pinned up in soft waves, heels higher than her typical taste. Who's hosting? I asked. Just a few of the charity board members, she said, smoothing a hand over her gown. I'll probably be late, so don't wait up. I nodded, hiding my intent. When she left, I followed. Not directly, but close enough to keep her Range Rover's taillights in sight. Snow whipped across the road, headlights slicing through flurries as I tailed her into Aspen proper. She pulled into the valet at the St. Regis. I parked a block away, slipped the valet a folded 100, swapped her ticket for mine, and when she emerged an hour later, I was ready. She didn't head inside to any dinner. Instead, she drove west out of town, toward a stretch of winding mountain road lined with private chalets. I hung back, killing my headlights when she turned onto a secluded drive. I sat in the shadows for nearly 20 minutes, engine idling, snow collecting on my windshield. Then the lights inside the chalet flared to life, warm against the dark. I pulled out my camera, zoomed, focused. Sophia's silhouette appeared in the window, framed by soft lamplight. She laughed, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat, and leaned into a tall, athletic man with sun-streaked hair. Even through the glass, I recognized him, Nico Laurent, Aspen's most in-demand ski instructor, perpetually featured in glossy magazines alongside bronze celebrities and whispered scandals. I watched, frozen in place, as she rested her hand against his chest and kissed him like she'd been doing it for months. I didn't storm in. I didn't rage. I clicked the shutter. Once. Twice. A quiet, mechanical confirmation that the world I thought I knew no longer existed. And as I sat there, hidden beneath the weight of falling snow, one thing became very, very clear. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. This was going to be a dismantling. Chapter 2, Ghosting the Truth. The snowstorm broke by morning, leaving the sky an impossible shade of cobalt blue and the mountains etched like marble under the sun. From the outside, Aspen looked untouched, pristine, serene. But for me, nothing felt steady anymore. Sophia moved around the kitchen like nothing had changed. Barefoot, hair tied up loosely, humming faintly as she chopped grapefruit wedges for breakfast. She looked soft, domestic, the same woman I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. Except she wasn't. Did the dinner run late? I asked, keeping my voice light. She didn't miss a beat. You know how these committees are. Endless speeches, everyone fighting for visibility. Right. I took a sip of coffee, watching her. She didn't look away, didn't fidget, didn't falter. Whatever script she'd rehearsed, she had it down cold. For a moment, I almost admired her composure. Almost. I spent the rest of the day at the Mercer Capital offices downtown, my mind only half on the quarterly forecast Danielle Reyes had laid out. Danielle, my COO, had worked with me for 8 years, whip-smart, loyal, sharp enough to read between lines, but discreet enough not to ask questions. "Something on your mind?" she asked finally, sliding the latest risk report across the table. I hesitated, then decided against confiding in her. "Not yet. Just noise," I said. "You know how it is this time of year." She nodded, but I saw her studying me carefully, as though filing my answer away for later. That night, I started digging. I had contacts in Aspen's service network, people you don't notice until you need them. Valets, hotel concierges, spa managers. even the guy who handled private lift scheduling for the resorts. In a town where half the wealth was old and the other half tried to look old, discretion was the real currency. One by one, I called in favors. It didn't take long to map out Sophia's last 3 spa days. Not a single one matched any booking in the area. Instead, her name appeared in guest logs for the St. Regis, the Limelight, and a private chalet listed under a shell company called Ardent Mountain Holdings. I knew the name. Everyone in finance did. It was whispered over single malt and steak dinners. A holding company used to launder high-end real estate deals through ski towns. Aspen, Vail, Jackson Hole. And there was another name that kept coming up alongside Ardent Mountain, Julian Kane. Julian Kane was a rival in every sense of the word. He built Kane Asset Management out of nothing but a few Ivy League contacts and an uncanny sense of timing. In 5 years, he'd turned himself into the darling of the private equity world and a constant thorn in my side. We'd crossed paths more times than I could count at conferences, investor retreats, gala dinners. He had that kind of effortless charm that made people lean in when he spoke, made them feel special just for being in his orbit. Beneath it, though, was something harder, colder. Now his name was tied to the chalet where Sophia disappeared on girls' weekends. Coincidence? Maybe, but my instincts rarely failed me. That weekend, Aspen's annual Winterfest Gala transformed the historic Wheeler Opera House into a cathedral of glass, firelight, and old money. Sophia insisted we attend. For visibility, she'd said with a smile. I wore my usual uniform, tailored charcoal Tom Ford, crisp white shirt, no tie. Power casual. Sophia wore ice blue satin, her hair falling in glossy waves that caught every camera flash. Together, we were the image of marital perfection. The moment we stepped inside, Julian Kane was there. He held a glass of something amber and expensive, standing with 2 tech CEOs and a retired senator. When he spotted us, his smile widened, lazy and sharp all at once. "Ethan Mercer," he said, voice smooth as silk. "Didn't expect to see you tonight. I thought you were buried prepping for the Snowcap Summit." "Even I take nights off," I said. Sophia leaned in, kissing his cheek. Too familiar, too effortless. "Julian," she said warmly. He glanced at her hand on my arm, then at me, holding my gaze just a fraction too long. "You should join me for a drink later," he said quietly, low enough that Sophia couldn't hear. "There are things you ought to know." I didn't respond. I just smiled and moved on, but his words lodged like a splinter under my skin. I skipped the after-party and drove home early, leaving Sophia behind to network. At the house, I poured myself a scotch and sat by the wide glass windows overlooking the valley. Outside, the snow had started again, falling heavy, relentless. At 12:47 a.m., Sophia texted, "Running late. Staying with Caro tonight. Don't wait up." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and began pulling everything I could on Ardent Mountain Holdings. Offshore entities, straw buyers, untraceable cash flows. On paper, the company was an investment vehicle for luxury real estate syndicates. In reality, it was cleaner for dirty money than most Cayman banks. And buried in one of the filings was a familiar name, Nico Laurent. Not as an investor, as a consultant. The ski instructor who kissed my wife was working for a shadow corporation moving billions through Aspen's most exclusive properties. That wasn't coincidence. That was architecture. The next morning, I paid a visit to the St. Regis under the guise of scheduling a private suite for an investor retreat. I chatted with the concierge, let a $100 bill do most of the talking. Within minutes, I had full access to the guest logs. Sophia had booked the same suite twice in the last 3 months. Suite 601, registered under Ardent Mountain Holdings. And she wasn't alone. Every time, the room next door was reserved for Julian Kane. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing, the slow rhythm of someone dreaming peacefully. My mind churned. Was this just an affair? Or was she a pawn in something bigger? Because if Julian Kane and Nico Laurent were tied to Ardent Mountain, and Sophia was tied to them, then this wasn't just betrayal. It was exposure. For me. For Mercer Capital. For everything I'd built. I started moving pieces the next day. Danielle Reyes locked down our internal systems, double-checked vendor agreements, combed through our offshore partnerships. I called in a favor from a contact at the SEC, discreetly requesting records on Ardent Mountain's acquisitions. Every step revealed more threads leading back to Aspen's gilded underbelly. Luxury chalets, ski lodges, private spas. Real estate that changed hands 3, 4, sometimes 5 times in a single year. Each transaction perfectly legal on paper, but anyone who understood cash flow could see it was a shell game. Someone was using Aspen's wealth as camouflage, and Sophia was tangled in the middle of it. By Thursday night, the pieces aligned just enough to make my stomach knot. I wasn't imagining things. Nico Laurent wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was working Julian Kane's angles, pulling her in, willingly or not, to help funnel money through properties tied to Ardent Mountain. I poured another drink, staring out into the dark, the mountain's black shapes against the snow. Somewhere up there, in a chalet bought under a holding company's name, secrets were being kept warm while everything outside froze solid. And for the first time since this began, I felt something colder than betrayal settle into my chest. I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Chapter 3: The Chalet. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, fat and heavy under the muted glow of the Range Rover's headlights. I trailed 3 car lengths behind Sophia, keeping my lights low, the hum of my engine nearly swallowed by the storm. It had been 2 weeks since the Winterfest Gala, and I'd been patient. Too patient. But tonight, I knew where she'd be headed. Sophia's wellness retreat had been rescheduled for the 3rd time this month. Same excuse, same alibi, same vague smile when I asked where, exactly, she was going. I didn't believe her anymore. I didn't want to. We wound past the city limits, through streets where plowed asphalt gave way to ice-crusted gravel. The mountains closed in on either side, steep shadows carved from white stone, the forest clinging like dark brushstrokes against the pale. Finally, she slowed, signaling onto a narrow private road marked by a hand-carved cedar sign. Chalet Valmont, guests only. I'd seen the name before. In Ardent Mountain Holdings filings. Her taillights disappeared around a bend. I killed my headlights, coasted into the shadows, and parked behind a snowbank. For 10 minutes, I sat in silence, breathing shallowly, letting the engine tick as it cooled. My gloves were stiff with cold. I pulled the hood of my parka tight, grabbed the camera, and stepped out into knee-deep snow. The chalet rose from the slope like something carved out of a dream. All glass and timber, sprawling terraces layered in snow, a jagged crown of stone chimneys belching thin plumes of smoke. Warm light glowed behind floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling across the white drifts. I kept low, following a line of evergreens until I had a clear view. Through the glass, I spotted Sophia immediately. She stood near the fireplace, wrapped in a cream cashmere shawl, one hand resting casually on a glass of wine. And she wasn't alone. Nico Laurent lounged across from her, perfectly at ease, his sun-streaked hair still damp from a shower, white thermal Henley clinging to his shoulders. I could see why she'd fallen for him. Rugged, effortless, charming in a way I could never fake. But there was someone else, too. Julian Kane. He sat between them in a leather armchair, legs crossed, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler like he owned the place. My pulse quickened. I circled around the chalet until I found a narrow side deck half buried in snow. A single door stood cracked open, letting out tendrils of wood smoke and warmth. Voices carried faintly over the hiss of wind. I pressed myself against the timber siding and listened. "We're ahead of schedule," Julian was saying. His tone was smooth, deliberate. "The Monaco property closes next week. Once that clears, we can move the second tranche into the Valmont holding." Nico's voice came next, low and tense. "That's assuming Mercer doesn't notice. He's not stupid." Julian chuckled softly. "Oh, Ethan's many things, but paranoid isn't one of them. The man still thinks these chalets exist for yoga retreats." Sophia laughed quietly, soft, restrained, unfamiliar. My grip on the railing tightened until my gloves creaked. Julian's voice dropped. "Nico, confirm. Did you transfer the second set of credentials?" "Done," Nico said. "Straight into the offshore wallets. No trail." "Good." Julian paused, then added, "And Sophia? You're certain Ethan hasn't noticed the diversion?" For a moment, there was silence, and I thought maybe she'd hesitate. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "Certain. He hasn't said a word," she said. "If he suspects anything, he's hiding it well." But knowing him, he doesn't. A cold, hollow weight settled in my chest. This wasn't just an affair. They were using her, or she was using me, to move money through my hedge fund. I stayed there for nearly 20 minutes, crouched in the snow, letting their words sharpen the edges of what I already knew. Mercer Capital wasn't just collateral damage. It was a tool. They were siphoning funds through luxury real estate deals, using my reputation and my client's capital as camouflage. Julian Kane wasn't simply seducing my wife away from me. He was dismantling everything I'd built. I backed away quietly, careful not to leave deep tracks, and slipped through the trees to my car. Halfway back, a branch cracked under my boot. The voices behind me went silent. I froze. Then came Nico's sharp tone, muffled by the storm. "Did you hear that?" I dropped into a crouch behind a fallen spruce. My breath steamed in the air, loud in my ears. Footsteps crunched across the deck above. A door opened wider, spilling golden light into the snow. Nico's voice again. "Julian, stay inside. I'll check it." "Shit." I moved, slow and deliberate, circling deeper into the trees until the light faded behind me. I didn't run until I was sure the wind had swallowed my tracks. By the time I reached the rover, my lungs burned from holding my breath. I slid inside, locked the doors, and sat in the dark, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Back home, the house was silent when I arrived. Sophia's side of the bed was empty, untouched. I sat on the edge of the mattress, stripped off my parka, and stared at nothing for what felt like hours. My camera sat on the nightstand, its memory card full of photos I hadn't yet looked at. When I finally forced myself to review them, each frame told a different story than the one I believed in. Sophia laughing, leaning into Nico, Julian sipping his drink like a king overseeing his pawns. I closed the laptop and poured a drink, the ice clinking like distant thunder in the empty room. By morning, I made a decision. Confrontation was pointless. Evidence was power. I called Danielle into my office and shut the door behind us. "How secure are our offshore accounts?" I asked. She blinked. "Secure. Triple authenticated, multi-sig wallets. Want? Check anyway. Look for unusual withdrawals. Cross-reference with Ardent Mountain Holdings." Danielle's brow furrowed. "You want me to dig into Ardent?" Quietly, I said. "Nobody outside this room needs to know." Her hesitation lasted half a breath before she nodded. "Understood." 2 days later, she slid a thin folder onto my desk without a word. Inside were transaction records. Dates, amounts, signatures, most falsified. 12 transfers in the last 6 months. Almost $60 million siphoned from Mercer Capital client accounts into Ardent Mountain acquisitions. "Ethan," Danielle said softly, "if this goes public, it could look like we're complicit." I closed the folder carefully. "We're not. Try proving that when the SEC comes knocking." I stared out the window at the snow-draped peaks, my reflection pale in the glass. Sophia wasn't just betraying me. She was the leverage they were using to destroy me. That night, Sophia came home late, cheeks flushed, eyes bright like she'd spent the evening somewhere warm and easy. "How was your night?" I asked casually, nursing a glass of scotch by the fire. "Productive," she said, sliding out of her coat. "Charity sponsors are locked in for next month. We'll hit our targets." I smiled faintly. "That's good to hear." She walked past me, leaning down to kiss my cheek, and I caught it. A faint trace of cologne. Expensive. Woody. Not mine. Not hers. Julian's. I let her walk upstairs without a word, her heels clicking softly against the reclaimed oak steps. Then I pulled out my phone and texted a single line to a contact I hadn't spoken to in years. "I need a favor. No questions. Secure surveillance package. Discreet." 10 minutes later, the reply came back. "Understood. It'll be ready by morning." I wasn't going to confront Sophia. I was going to dismantle her world. And if Julian Kane thought he could use me to launder his fortune and walk away clean, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Chapter 4: Fractures Beneath the Ice. The morning after the charity dinner was unnaturally quiet, as if Aspen itself had been stunned into silence. The streets, normally buzzing with early risers heading to the slopes, seemed subdued beneath a relentless snowfall. I sat by the window in my study, nursing a coffee I barely tasted, watching the snowflakes spiral lazily down. My phone buzzed every few minutes, text messages, calls, voicemails, but I ignored them all. My wife, Claire had left the house before dawn. No bags, no farewell, no attempt to plead her case. Just absence. It should have felt like victory. Instead, there was something gnawing at me, an unease that crept in like a draft under a locked door. By mid-morning, Aspen's rumor mill had done its work. Word spread fast in this town, especially among those who thrived on appearances. Friends called under the guise of concern, their voices laced with curiosity. Investors checked in too, subtle in their phrasing but obvious in their intent. Was everything under control? I reassured them all with the same measured calm. Nothing's changed, I told them. The fund is solid. Claire and I were parting ways, but it's handled. Handled. Such a clean word for something so messy. That afternoon, I headed into town. The cold air bit at my face as I walked down Galena Street, past boutiques with frosted windows and restaurants humming with lunchtime chatter. A few heads turned as I passed. Whispers, sideways glances. Aspen could be as brutal as Wall Street when it sensed weakness. I ducked into the Monarch, a quiet steakhouse off the main drag, where my friend and lawyer, James Kessler, was already waiting in a back booth. James had the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Tall, broad-shouldered, perpetually dressed in dark wool coats that made him look more like a security detail than an attorney. "You sure you want to be seen here?" he asked as I slid into the seat across from him. "If we hide, we look guilty," I said flatly. James leaned back, studying me. "Fair, but you've just blown up Aspen's power couple. People are going to start choosing sides. Then we make sure they choose mine," I said. We ordered steaks, though neither of us touched much of it when it arrived. Instead, I handed James a small black folder, a condensed version of the evidence I'd used at the charity dinner. Photos, receipts, travel confirmations. Enough to destroy Claire's reputation if she tried to play the victim publicly. "She's already moving fast," James said, scanning the papers. "I heard through one of my contacts she's trying to liquidate some assets, quietly." "She can try," I replied. "But everything significant is locked down. She doesn't have access to the core accounts anymore." James gave a small, approving nod. "Good, because something tells me this isn't over." I looked past him, out the window where snow continued to fall in a hypnotic dance. "It never is," I murmured. That night, I returned to the chalet alone. The silence of the place felt heavier now, pressing down on me like the weight of the snow on the roof. I poured myself a bourbon, sank into the leather chair by the fire, and tried to lose myself in the crackle of the flames. Then my phone vibrated. An email. No subject line, no sender name. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sentence. "You think you've won, William. You have no idea what she's capable of." My breath caught. No signature, but I didn't need one. "Claire." I stared at the words for a long time, the fire popping behind me. What unsettled me most wasn't the threat itself. It was the fact that I believed it. The next morning, James called. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "One of your junior analysts was approached last night at Eric's bar. Someone tried fishing for insider info on the fund's holdings." "Who?" "No name," James said. "But according to the analyst, they hinted they knew Claire." I was silent for a moment, gripping the edge of my desk. This wasn't just a messy divorce anymore. Claire wasn't just lashing out emotionally. She was moving strategically, leveraging her access, her connections. And if she was willing to burn down my reputation to get even, she'd already made her first move. The snow outside kept falling, soft and endless, covering the town like a shroud. But beneath it, fractures were forming. Aspen was about to crack. Chapter 5, Embers in the Snow. By the time I reached the office the next morning, Aspen felt colder than usual. Not just the air, the atmosphere. The town had gone quiet in a way I didn't like. A kind of watchfulness hung over everything, like people were waiting for a show they knew was about to start. Inside the Sinclair Capital headquarters, the tension was palpable. Conversation stopped when I walked past. Eyes dropped to phones and keyboards. My assistant, Marissa, met me outside my glass-walled office, clutching a tablet like a shield. "You need to see this," she said, voice low. On the screen was a headline from Aspen Confidential, a gossip blog infamous for ripping apart reputations. Inside Sinclair's shattered marriage, sources claim infidelity, financial manipulation, and secret offshore deals. I scrolled, jaw tightening. The article was a surgical strike. Unverified claims, veiled accusations, and just enough truth mixed in to make it dangerous. This came from Claire, I said. Marissa didn't argue. She's been seen around town. Lunch with Tasha Merriweather yesterday, cocktails with Daniel Keene last night. I didn't need her to explain who they were. Tasha ran half the charity circuit. Daniel controlled whispers in Aspen like a puppeteer pulling strings. Claire was rebuilding her alliances, weaponizing gossip, turning my social capital against me. That evening, James came over to the chalet. He shook snow off his coat and tossed a folder onto my desk. "Private investigator," he said. "She hired 1-2 days after the dinner." I flipped through the photos, grainy telephoto shots of me at my office, at the Monarch, even outside the chalet. Pages of notes on my meetings, transactions, travel patterns. "She's digging for something," James said. "She won't find anything illegal." "She doesn't need to," he countered. "She just needs something that looks bad enough to raise eyebrows." I poured us both drinks, though neither of us touched them. "She wants a war," I said finally. James nodded grimly. "She's already started one." 2 days later, Claire made her first public move. She arrived at the Aspen Art Museum gala draped in a crimson silk gown, smiling for cameras like nothing had happened. On her arm was a man I didn't recognize, mid-30s, European, the kind of polished arrogance you only find in trust fund heirs and startup founders. The tabloids called him Adrien Lemaire, a French tech investor with a reputation for disrupting companies and people. I didn't attend the gala, but the photos hit social media within minutes. Claire laughing, Adrien's hand on her back, the two of them locked in whispered conversations with half the town's power players. It was calculated, deliberate. She was staking her claim, painting me as the cold, absentee husband while recasting herself as the resilient, glamorous survivor. James called that night, his voice tight. "She's building a coalition. Lemaire's not here for her. He's here for you." "What does he want?" I asked. "Leverage. And Claire just handed him a front row seat to your empire." I set the phone down, pacing the length of my study. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Claire wasn't playing defense anymore. She was attacking. By the weekend, subtle cracks began to appear in Sinclair Capital's foundation. 2 potential investors paused pending deals. One major client requested an internal audit of our strategies. And rumors, whispered, insidious, began threading through Aspen's elite circles. Insider trading, over-leveraged positions, possible SEC interest. None of it true, but perception in this world was everything. James sent over a revised strategy packet, but I barely skimmed it. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the office window, the snowstorm outside blurring the edges of the mountains. Claire wanted me to lash out. She wanted me to overreact, to make mistakes she could exploit. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one. But I'd fight it my way. Slow, quiet, precise. And when I struck back, there would be nothing left of her alliances but ashes in the snow. Chapter 6, The Silent Offensive. The storm rolled into Aspen overnight, turning the mountains into a monochrome blur. By morning, the valley was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. It should have been quiet, serene. But inside Sinclair Capital, the tension felt electric, like the air before lightning strikes. Claire had moved her first pawn. Now it was my turn. I called James into my office, locking the glass door behind him. He glanced at the muted news feed on the wall, where another gossip blog headline scrolled across the ticker. Adrien Lemaire, Aspen's newest power player. Ties to Sinclair divorce drama? She's already getting traction, James said, throwing himself into a chair. You ready to hit back? Not yet, I said, sliding a black folder across the desk. First, I need to know everything about Adrien Lemaire. James opened it and frowned at the empty pages. Whoever he is, I continued, he didn't just appear out of nowhere. Claire doesn't move without leverage. I want to know where his money comes from, what skeletons he's hiding, and who he answers to. Quietly, James smiled faintly. You want a ghost to hunt a ghost. I want to see his entire hand before I lay down a card. 2 days later, I got my first breadcrumb. James sent me an encrypted file at 2 a.m. Inside were offshore filings, shell company structures, and a string of financial transfers that smelled like blood in the water. Adrien wasn't just a tech investor. He was a fixer, a man who bought distressed companies, gutted them, and sold the carcasses overseas. More importantly, he He had ties to a private equity group under investigation in the EU for laundering money through crypto exchanges. Exactly the kind of man Claire would cozy up to if she wanted someone who could destabilize me. But there was something else, buried deep in an Italian court docket, tied to an alias I almost missed. Adrian had a sealed arrest record. Burglary, James confirmed on the phone, his voice low. 10 years ago in Milan. Violent. That was leverage. I hired Nora Keene next. If Adrian was a ghost, Nora was a wraith. Former intelligence analyst, now a private operator who specialized in quiet extractions of information. Her reputation was simple. If Nora took your case, you either got the truth or the corpse. We met in the back booth of a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. She listened, silent, as I laid out the situation. You don't want her back, she said finally, sipping her whiskey. No, you want control. I want to end this without anyone realizing I started it. She smiled thinly. Then you hired the right person. By the end of the week, Nora had planted a tracker in Adrian's rental SUV, spoofed his phone's metadata, and inserted a worm into Claire's cloud storage. What we found there made my stomach tighten. Claire wasn't just posturing with Adrian. She was feeding him documents. Confidential memos from Sinclair Capital, contract drafts, early-stage investor decks. Nothing outright illegal, but enough for him to undermine deals, spook investors, and destabilize my position piece by piece. She was playing for keeps. Good. So was I? The counterstrike began subtly. First, I leaked a false investment proposal into the same folder Claire had access to. A shiny but toxic deal involving a fictional biotech firm. Within days, Adrian moved resources toward it, burning relationships with 2 of his real investors in the process. Next, I seeded whispers into Aspen's inner circles, small, casual remarks to the right people at the right cocktail parties. By Monday, murmurs of Adrian's shady crypto past had already reached 3 major donors on the charity circuit. He was radioactive before he even realized the fire had started. Finally, I set the trap. Using Nora's access, we planted an internal Sinclair audit report, fabricated but convincing, implying that the SEC was quietly investigating Adrian's offshore dealings. When Adrian opened the file, our worm traced his IP back to a shadow account tied directly to Claire's name. 2 birds, 1 stone. The night the trap closed, I stood on the chalet balcony, watching snow drift lazily under the pale moonlight. Below, Aspen glimmered like a handful of diamonds scattered across black velvet. James called, his voice unusually sharp. You're pushing her into a corner, he warned. That's the point. She's not stupid, Liam. She'll know you're behind this soon. I sipped my scotch, letting the silence stretch. Then I'll be ready, I said. Because once she realizes what I've done, it'll already be too late. Chapter 7. Fractures in the Glass. The first blow came in the form of an anonymous email. It landed in the inboxes of every board member of Sinclair Capital at 7:14 a.m. sharp. Subject line: How much do you really know about William Sinclair? Inside was a link to a Dropbox folder. Inside the folder was chaos. Old contracts, private correspondence, whispers of questionable tax shields. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, but enough to plant a cancerous seed of doubt. The kind of curated half-truths designed to make powerful people hesitate before answering your calls. Claire hadn't just retaliated. She'd gone nuclear. By noon, I'd called an emergency board meeting at the Aspen office. The room was filled with old money paranoia. 6 men and 2 women, all looking at me like I was either their savior or the architect of their ruin. This is a smear campaign, I said, keeping my voice measured. Whoever's behind it cherry-picked documents to create suspicion where none exists. One of the older directors, Margaret Travers, leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her teeth. And what about the rumors, William? The whispers about offshore assets? About a personal account in Luxembourg? That stung. Because it wasn't entirely untrue. Adrian had gotten his claws into my private holdings. Claire had given him access to files I'd buried so deep, I'd almost forgotten about them myself. That wasn't just an attack on Sinclair Capital. That was an attack on me. I left the meeting to find Nora waiting in the lobby, her black coat dusted with snow. She didn't bother with pleasantries. They went public, she said flatly. Adrian pushed a story to Aspen Confidential. It drops at midnight. Headline's a killer. I exhaled, sharp and cold. How bad? She hesitated, which told me everything. They're framing you as a corporate predator who uses shell companies to funnel investor money into personal ventures. They've got doctored files, but to anyone outside, it'll look airtight. Proof? Fake, she said, but convincing. I stared out the frosted window at the falling snow, weighing my options. Do we bury it? I asked. She shook her head. If you try to smother this, they'll spin it as guilt. You need to get ahead of it. By nightfall, Aspen Confidential went live. William Sinclair exposed. Offshore schemes, insider manipulation, and the shadow empire behind Sinclair Capital. By morning, the Wall Street Journal had picked it up. My name wasn't just in the dirt, it was trending. James barged into my office mid-afternoon, pale and tight-lipped. We're hemorrhaging investor confidence. 2 of our biggest partners are requesting audits. Claire played this perfectly. No, I said quietly, almost to myself. This isn't perfect. What? She moved too fast. Nora arrived minutes later with her laptop under her arm. She dropped into the chair opposite me and spun the screen around. This, she said, tapping a file tree, is Adrian's weak point. On the display were his offshore accounts, his laundering trails, his sealed Milan record. Adrian wasn't just messy, he was radioactive. But going after him directly was risky. Too obvious. Instead, we'd feed the beast. 3 nights later, at a charity gala in downtown Aspen, I walked straight into the lion's den. Claire was there, draped in black silk, Adrian's hand resting possessively on her lower back. Cameras clicked around them like cicadas. I approached casually, glass of champagne in hand. Adrian, I said, with a polite smile. Enjoying Aspen? His jaw flexed just slightly. Immensely. You. I leaned in, lowering my voice so only he could hear. I wonder, I said softly, how Le Journal de Genève would feel about your Milan incident. Or your little crypto laundromat in Lugano. Oh, and the Thai passport. That's creative. His eyes flickered, a ripple beneath the surface. He didn't bite back, but I knew I'd hit him where it hurt. Claire caught the exchange instantly. Her smile tightened, just slightly, before she slid her hand around Adrian's arm and pulled him away. Good. Let her stew. But the reprieve lasted less than 48 hours. Because that's when the second email leak detonated. Only this time, it wasn't about offshore accounts. It was personal. Photos of me and Elena Vass, a venture partner I'd once had a 3-week fling with years before Claire. Texts, dinner receipts, hotel confirmations. Adrian had weaponized my past. By noon, every financial blog in the country was salivating. Headlines blurred together. Sinclair's secret affairs. From boardroom to bedroom. Who is Elena Vass? Can Sinclair Capital survive the scandal? I could practically feel the walls of Sinclair Capital cracking around me. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about dismantling my empire. Claire wanted me destroyed. That night, standing alone in the darkened chalet, I poured 2 fingers of Oban and watched snow swallow the valley. James called, his voice low and urgent. William, he said, we have a bigger problem. Bigger than a front-page scandal? I asked dryly. Yes, he said. Adrian's not just going after you. He's been moving capital in the Caymans, under Sinclair's name. If this sticks, we're looking at federal investigations. I didn't reply immediately, because I knew, then, that Claire and Adrian weren't just trying to ruin me. They were setting me up to burn. And if I didn't move first, they'd succeed. Chapter 8, Avalanche Point. The wind howled against the glass walls of my study, rattling the panes like warning whispers from the mountains. Outside, Aspen's pristine snow glimmered under a full moon, flawless and cold, much like the face I had worn for weeks. Tonight, that mask came off. For too long, I had played defense, reacting to their moves, cataloging their lies. Adrian's charm was snake oil, slick enough to lure even the most guarded investors. And Claire, well, Claire knew exactly where to twist the knife. But I had stopped bleeding. Tonight, the predator was done waiting. I sat behind the walnut desk, fingers steepled, laptop glowing faintly in the dim light. A spreadsheet filled the screen, neat columns of names, accounts, dates. Every silent transfer Adrian had orchestrated through his shell companies. Months of shadow work had unearthed it, but raw data alone wouldn't kill him. No, I needed something theatrical. A trap. Something so perfectly baited that neither Adrian nor Claire could resist. And once they bit, there would be no climbing back up. The plan hinged on Avalanche Point, an exclusive $500 million resort project whispered about among Aspen's elite. The city council had fought to keep it under wraps, but I had a friend on the inside, someone who owed me more than a favor. The project was controversial, environmental lawsuits pending, federal permits tangled in red tape. Adrian didn't know that, so I leaked just enough. A forged dossier, dripping with confidential internal memos and faked feasibility reports, planted on an encrypted investor network Adrian frequented. To him, it would look like gold, a chance to buy land cheap, leverage the delays, and walk away with obscene profit. Claire, hungry for her own slice of freedom and status, would feed him anything he needed to move quickly. It wasn't just bait, it was poison. I stood, poured a two-fingered glass of Yamazaki 18, and stared at my reflection in the window, the same face Aspen's elite trusted with their portfolios, the same voice CNBC called measured and visionary. They'd never suspect the man with the curated smile, the silk ties, the charity board seats. That was my edge. And then my phone buzzed. A single text from my contact downtown. They're in. Adrian moved $10 million into Helix Ventures. Claire brokered it. I exhaled slowly, savoring it. Phase 1, complete. But victory wouldn't come from bleeding them financially. This was bigger. Dirtier. Adrian had moved investor money into an unverified project, technically, fraud. Claire had acted as his intermediary, leaving her digital fingerprints on every transfer. And when the time came, I would make sure every whisper, every receipt, every pixel of evidence landed where it would hurt most. The SEC, Aspen's business review boards, every investor Adrian had ever charmed. One move. Total collapse. I sipped my whiskey, the taste sharp, electric. Then, a soft creak echoed down the hallway, floorboards shifting under careful weight. I set the glass down silently, my other hand instinctively reaching for the drawer where the Glock rested. William, a voice whispered. Claire. She stepped into the study doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, hair damp from the shower, skin pale under the soft amber light. Her smile was brittle, like glass about to fracture. You've been busy, she said, her voice low. Not seductive, not playful, calculated. I didn't answer. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed. Adrian thinks he's ahead of you. But I know you, William. I know that stillness in your face when you're hunting. Something cold crawled down my spine. This wasn't confession. This was warning. You should stop, she whispered. Before this gets ugly. He isn't like you. I took a step closer, my voice steady but edged. No, he isn't like me. That's why he's going to lose. For the first time, her expression cracked. Fear, fleeting but real, before she masked it again. Then she smiled faintly, almost pityingly. Be careful what you wish for. She turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving the faint scent of jasmine and something darker, inevitability. I stood there, Glock still in hand, heart steady despite the storm gathering outside and inside. Tomorrow, Adrian would believe he'd struck gold. Claire would believe she'd won freedom. And by this time next week, the avalanche would bury them both. Chapter 9, The Black Ledger. Aspen had a strange way of keeping its secrets. Beneath the champagne smiles and glacial charm, the town was a pressure cooker of ego, money, and grudges. Everyone pretended to be friends at gallery openings and charity dinners, but one leak, one bad headline, could collapse entire dynasties overnight. I'd counted on that truth when I set the Avalanche Point trap, but I underestimated Adrian. The first sign came at 7:43 a.m., a notification on my encrypted line, not from my broker, not from my contact inside City Hall, but from a burner address traced back to an offshore relay I'd seen before. Adrian's footprint. Subject: You're not the only one who knows where the bodies are buried. Attached: one PDF. I hesitated only a moment before opening it. The file was titled, Black Ledger, Sinclair Holdings. Inside, 37 pages of data so toxic it made my chest tighten. Unfiled tax shelters. Payments routed through shell trusts in the Caymans. Early acquisitions padded with consulting fees that looked suspiciously like bribes. Not my doing, not directly, but the kind of quiet sins baked into any empire built as fast as mine. Adrian had hacked my house of cards. And then, the second email landed. This one from an Aspen Business Review journalist I knew personally. William, I'm hearing chatter from 2 sources about irregularities at Sinclair Holdings. Off the record, you might want to get ahead of this before it turns into a story. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mountain skyline, the crisp snow glittering like fractured glass. Adrian wasn't taking the bait. He was turning the trap inside out. By noon, the air inside Montrose House, Aspen's most exclusive private club, was thick with quiet war. I walked past the oil paintings and dark oak panels, nodding at men whose net worths could buy islands, each of them watching me a second too long. Word was spreading, and there he was, Adrian Morrow. He sat at a round table in the corner, jacket draped casually over his chair, espresso steaming beside him. He smiled as I approached, that infuriating, polished smile built to disarm rooms and ruin reputations. William, he said, leaning back. You've been busy. Avalanche Point, was it? Brilliant, in theory. You moved 10 million into a black hole, I said flatly. SEC's going to love that. Adrian chuckled softly, swirling his espresso. And they'll care so much, until they're knee-deep in a story about Sinclair's shell games. That ledger isn't fake, by the way. I didn't even have to forge anything. You handed me your weapons years ago. Go public, I said, lowering my voice, and you'll burn with me. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished oak. His cologne, cedar and smoke, hit like a warning. Here's the difference between us, William, Adrian whispered. I don't have a public image to lose. You do. People don't invest in me. They invest in you. The man they think you are. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't since this started. Heat. Not panic. Not fear. Rage. You touched my company, I said quietly. You touched my name. Adrian smiled wider, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. And I'm not done. Claire's already talking to people. People you can't control. You think you set a trap, William. But this isn't a game of mousetraps. He tapped the side of his espresso cup. This is chess. And you just sacrificed your queen. By nightfall, Aspen was buzzing. The whispers had bled into the public air. Cocktails parties murmuring about regulatory inquiries. Traders texting about insider deals gone wrong. Even CNBC ran a throwaway headline. Storm clouds over Sinclair Holdings. Exactly what Adrian wanted. I locked myself in the study, pulling up every encrypted channel, every back-end ledger I had. My entire empire, the reputation I'd built brick by brick, was being dragged into the open. Claire's fingerprints were all over his plays now, feeding Adrian breadcrumbs about my vulnerabilities, about where to squeeze. And that was when I realized something deeper. Adrian wasn't just after money. He wanted obliteration. But I had one card left. One nuclear option. I opened a hidden drive on my system, entering the 16-character passphrase I hadn't touched in 5 years. A series of files populated the screen, each tagged with innocuous labels. Oberlin_trust.pdf, Redwater for transfer, AMOV, Aspen unfolded meeting, AC. Adrian thought he understood leverage. He thought blackmail made him untouchable. But he didn't know what I had on the people funding him. One wrong move from him, and I'd drag half of Aspen's financial elite into the mud with him. This wasn't defense anymore. This was total war. But then my phone buzzed again. A single, anonymous message. You're running out of time. She's not playing for him anymore. Claire. Switching sides. We're playing both. Either way, the board had just fractured. Chapter 10, Snowfall and Ashes. The snow had stopped, leaving Aspen deceptively serene. Streets glimmered under streetlights, pure and untouched, but the air was electric, as if the town itself sensed the storm that was about to erupt. Inside the chalet, I sat at the long walnut table, monitors and encrypted drives arrayed around me like soldiers before battle. Claire had moved again, not with Adrian this time, but alone. Her fingerprints were all over an email sent to Sinclair's top 3 investors. A subtle nudge of doubt wrapped in concern, citing financial irregularities I hadn't seen before. Adrian would see it immediately, and he did. Within minutes, I received encrypted confirmations from Nora. Adrian had redirected half his new holdings into a Cayman trust linked to an untraceable shell company. My trap was live, but he was already adapting. Tom was no longer on my side. The plan had 3 layers. Layer 1, the public exposure. Files from my nuclear drive. The Oberlin Trust documents, Redwater transfers, and Aspen vault recordings would be leaked anonymously to journalists who had credibility with financial regulators. Adrian would be implicated in illegal schemes. Claire, if she interfered, would be caught helping him. Layer 2, the psychological squeeze. I'd plant subtle hints directly to Adrian. Emails, texts, and financial leaks that suggested a mole in his network. Enough to make him paranoid, second-guessing every move. Layer 3, the ultimate checkmate. The final lever involved Claire. She wanted power, leverage, freedom. If she tried to double-cross me, the evidence I had on her dealings with Adrian would hit the press. Every deal, every wire transfer, every whispered conversation exposed. It was a delicate balancing act. One misstep, and I'd go from predator to prey. By evening, Aspen's elite were already whispering. The first journalist hit my phone. "William, there's chatter that Adrian Lemaire is tied to offshore scams. Want to comment?" I replied calmly, with just enough truth to suggest diligence. "We are reviewing all accounts and remain committed to transparency. Sinclair Capital is fully cooperating with auditors." The message was a spark in dry snow. Soon, Adrian panicked. Within hours, I watched through Nora's systems as he tried to reroute funds, destroy digital breadcrumbs, and contact Claire for guidance. But she was already stepping away, calculating the moment to emerge as the survivor, a move that could either redeem her or condemn her. I set the final trap at the Helix Gala, an invitation-only event where Aspen's power players and investors congregated under the guise of charity. Claire arrived, radiant in white, Adrian at her side. Cameras flashed, catching every moment. But the evening had already been rigged. Adrian's phone, hacked through a planted worm, uploaded live files to a secure server monitored by Nora. Journalists with encrypted emails were ready to publish the damning evidence. Every investor Claire had coaxed into doubt received an anonymous tip linking her actions directly to Adrian's schemes. They walked in thinking they were untouchable. I walked in behind them, unnoticed, glass of whiskey in hand, calm and measured. Every step echoed like a drumbeat. Adrian caught my eye. His composure flickered for a split second. Claire's smile tightened, the first crack in her flawless facade. I raised my glass slightly, just enough for them to see. No words, just a signal. Then it started. Emails were delivered. Screens lit up. Investors whispered in panic. Adrian's digital fortress collapsed, each layer exposing the next. A subtle push from my team revealed the forged Avalanche Point files as toxic. Every transaction Adrian made now flagged for scrutiny. Claire's interference. Her communications with Adrian appeared alongside the evidence, painting her as the architect of the chaos she thought she controlled. Adrian lunged for his phone. Claire tried to intercept. Too late. The avalanche had begun. By the end of the evening, Adrian was cornered. Regulators were calling. Journalists were filing follow-ups. Investors pulled back. Every plan he'd meticulously laid had exploded in his face. And Claire, she was caught in the crossfire, her path to freedom blocked by the very empire she tried to manipulate. I stood at the balcony afterward, watching snow swirl around the gala lights below. Silence. Calm. Victory. But the thrill wasn't in crushing them. It was in outthinking them, anticipating every move, and proving that patience, precision, and quiet mastery could conquer even the most ruthless adversaries. Snow may hide footprints, but it cannot hide ambition. And tonight, under Aspen's frozen sky, I had won. Chapter 11. The Frost Aftermath. The morning after the Helix Gala, Aspen felt hollow. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked from the chalet to the office, a brittle quiet blanketing the streets. Gossip had already done its work. Adrian's name was toxic, his assets frozen pending investigation, and Claire's credibility shattered among the town's elite. The avalanche had run its course. Inside Sinclair Capital, the atmosphere was tense but stabilizing. Investors called with cautious optimism, impressed by how quickly I had contained the chaos. Some even offered congratulations, thinly veiled, yes, but acknowledgement nonetheless. I sat in my office, letting the weight of the last few weeks settle. The world had shifted, and I had survived. Claire didn't show up for weeks. Rumors circulated, whispers that she had fled Aspen, retracing her steps to Europe, perhaps to France, perhaps to a new life. Adrian, trapped by investigations and frozen accounts, disappeared from public view entirely. The chessboard had been reset, but the pieces remained, bruised, battered, and wary. James came over one evening, breaking the silence of my study. "You've secured your empire," he said quietly, eyes scanning the city lights. "But at what cost?" I leaned back, staring at the snow-dusted mountains. "Cost?" I asked, voice low. "Everything has a cost. I lost sleep, trust, a part of myself I didn't know I had to give. But I kept what matters intact. Sinclair capital, my reputation, my life." James gave a small, knowing nod. "And Claire?" I didn't answer immediately. There was no satisfaction in her downfall, not really. Victory was sharp, yes, but hollow when weighed against betrayal, deception, and the human cost of precision vengeance. "She's gone," I said finally. "Snow hides footprints, but it doesn't erase the past. And some lessons stick." Life in Aspen slowly returned to its rhythm. Charity galas, board meetings, and ski weekends continued as if nothing had happened. But beneath the sparkling surfaces, the ripples of my war lingered. Investors were cautious, competitors wary, and the town's elite, the very ones who had watched the fall of Adrian and Claire, now understood that I was not a man to be underestimated. One evening, standing on the balcony of the chalet, I poured a glass of Oban and watched the sun set behind the snow-covered peaks. Silence. Calm. The faint glow of lights in the valley reminded me that life moves forward, even after the harshest storms. I thought of Claire, Adrian, the boardroom chaos, the whispers, the near collapse. And I smiled faintly, because patience, calculation, and quiet mastery had prevailed. The snow fell softly, blanketing Aspen once more. Footprints were hidden, but the truth remained beneath the surface. And that truth, as sharp and cold as the mountain air, was mine. Epilogue: Shadows in the Snow. Winter had begun its slow retreat from Aspen, the snow melting in rivulets along streets and rooftops, revealing the town beneath, polished, bustling, and deceptively calm. Yet the echoes of the storm I had endured lingered in ways no thaw could erase. Claire never returned. Rumors swirled that she had relocated to the Côte d'Azur, living quietly, perhaps rich but stripped of influence, her ambition dulled by the weight of her failure. Adrien Lemaire remained under investigation in Europe. His empire had crumbled before it fully materialized, leaving him isolated, hunted by regulators, and betrayed by the very woman he had thought an ally. As for me, life moved forward with a semblance of normalcy. Sinclair capital regained its footing, investors reassured by the speed and precision with which I had contained the chaos. Aspen's elite treated me with cautious respect, admiration mingled with fear. A reminder that beneath my composed exterior, there was a man who could orchestrate storms and survive them intact. But the cost was not invisible. Nights were quieter now, often spent alone in the chalet, the wind whispering through the trees like the echo of old betrayals. The taste of victory was tempered by the memories of meticulous planning, the surveillance, the constant calculations that had consumed months of my life. I had won, yes, but I had done so by immersing myself in the shadows, by becoming someone who could strike unseen. Standing on the balcony one evening, I watched snowflakes drift lazily from the darkening sky. Aspen glimmered below, pristine and untroubled, unaware of the battles fought, the loyalties tested, the subtle wars waged behind closed doors. I raised a glass of Oban, the amber liquid catching the final light of the sun. Some betrayals demand fire. Others demand patience and quiet mastery. Some victories leave scars that never fade, hidden beneath the surface, as untraceable as the footprints in freshly fallen snow. I had chosen the latter, and in the stillness of that winter night, I understood that power, patience, and precision were weapons just as sharp as any blade. The snow would cover the evidence of the past, but the truth, my truth, would endure. Aspen had returned to its serene facade, but I knew better. Shadows remained in the snow, and I would always see them. Because in the end, the lesson was simple. The storm might pass, but the calm that follows belongs only to those who can master it.